So this is the point in the talk where I'd normally thank the organizers. But as you probably all know, I was a pretty useless organizer. I couldn't even manage to keep a website up for the duration of the meeting.
It was an act of God.
So I'd like to thank Chris for putting up with my useless organization skills. Just in case you want to, you can follow exactly what's going on with the... This is my hosting provider status web page. This is extremely unusual, right? If you look at all previous incidents, they all get resolved within an hour or so. And just this one time, they've been extremely reliable in the past. It's taken them so long to resolve it. So apparently they're still working on it. We'll see if the website comes back at any point during the meeting. But mainly I'd like to, so I think a workshop like this is going to be the quality of the discussion that really makes this a great workshop. So I'd like to thank all of the great participants for coming here and sharing your thoughts, and hopefully you will roundly criticize the ideas I'm about to present here. The only other thing I did as an organizer was I used the fact that I was an organizer to persuade Chris to let me give basically the first talk after his. So it means I'm the first one who gets to present all these Wigner-based paradoxes, and you all have to basically respond to the view that I present here. So that's good for me. I don't know how good for you it is. So what I want to do here is give, at least from my perspective, a bit of an overview of these kind of results and what they're useful for. So here are the aims that I hope to get to in this talk. So first of all, I'm going to talk about what I mean by Copenhagenish interpretations. I want to define the common ground, right? So I want to say what does, for example, Cubism have in common with Jeff Boob's views and Czeslaw Bruckner's views, etc. Okay, so I want to try and precisely define what that common ground is. I'm going to spend a little time rehashing the old stuff. This will be sort of familiar to probably most people in the audience, but it's not familiar to people in quantum foundations as a whole. I think a lot of people do still think that the measurement problem is a problem for Copenhagenish interpretations, so it's worth talking about it. Then I want to give what I personally think is the best version of this Bell-Wigner mashup kind of no-go theorem, whatever you want to call it. And the conclusion of that is that Copenhagenish interpretation should be perspectival. I will explain exactly what I mean by that. Then I put this last one in brackets. If there's time, which there probably won't be, what I want to say is that things like cubism and Ravelli's relational quantum mechanics are much more perspectival than they need to be in light of the result of the theorem. So what I want to do, at least as an exercise, is to try and outline a Copenhagenish interpretation that would be minimally perspectival. It's not something that I think of as being very realistic, but still, as an exercise to see what you need to do. All right, so let's talk about Copenhagenish interpretations. So what I mean by this is that, and I get on very thorny ground here, because whenever I try to say anything about this, somebody will object. Somebody who believes in one of these interpretations will be rejected. So I'm trying to be careful in defining these things as precisely and in a way that everybody will agree as possible. But of course, I welcome heckling from the audience when you disagree. So what I mean is, roughly speaking, interpretations that are closer in spirit to the ideas of the Copenhagen founders, Bohr, Heisenberg, Pauli, etc., than they are to what you might call the hard-headed realism that was favored by the likes of John Bell. Okay, so I certainly don't mean interpretations that are literally the views of Bohr and Heisenberg or anything like that. But it's clear that there is some kind of alternative option that's sort of beyond, that's different from things like de Broglie-Bohm theory and spontaneous collapse and many worlds in its attitude towards reality. So examples of these types of interpretations, Bruckner's, Bupitowski information interpretation, Healy's quantum pragmatism, cubism, Ravelli's relational quantum mechanics. Those are probably the main sort of contemporary versions of this view. There are others, like there are others that you can find in the literature. So it's difficult to find a terminology for this kind of interpretation that everybody will accept. For instance, Chris has historically complained about the association with the word Copenhagen here, because Copenhagen is strongly associated with Bohr, and as you know, Chris prefers Pauli and Wheeler to Bohr, but that's the reason for this ish qualification, right? So I'm calling it Copenhagenish, not Neo-Copenhagen. I don't want it to be too strongly associated directly with the views of Bohr, but just to suggest this sort of alternative to hard-headed realism. So of course these interpretations all differ on key issues, like a key one being, is the quantum state actually objective or subjective? So for instance, Richard Healy says that quantum states are objective. Cubism says they're extremely subjective, and that's a very key difference. It's a very important difference, but I nonetheless claim that there's enough common ground in these interpretations to view them as variants of the same basic interpretation in some sense. In the same sense that if we're thinking about de Broglie-Bohm theory, there's a core de Broglie-Bohm theory that everybody who advocates it agrees on, and they disagree on issues like exactly how we should think of the status of the quantum state, exactly how we should think about difference between configuration space and real three-dimensional space. Those things Bohmians differ on, okay? But nonetheless, we can identify a core view there, and that's kind of what I'm trying to do here for the Copenhagenish variety. So why should we care about defining this common ground? I argue it's because it will make the interpretations much more robust to criticism from the sort of hard-headed realist folks. Because since I argue that we haven't done a very good job of defining the common ground, we've made it very easy for them to argue against this kind of interpretation. Badly, but nonetheless. So as an example, you could look at the chapter on Copenhagen interpretations in Travis Nawson's recent book, and the argument sort of goes something like this. Please don't send that slide to him. So first of all, there's like a statement, well, these interpretations are anti-realist, and I just don't like anti-realism. Look, I give you a ton of philosophical arguments why realism is better than anti-realism, right? So there's that kind of argument. The next thing that is very common is to, and it's not just Travis who does this, obviously. You can just gather some quotes from the literature by Bohr and Heisenberg from the historical founders. We all know that Bohr is notoriously hard to read, and people are, historians still debate what he actually meant, right? So it's very easy to gather some quotes which sort of seem confusing and contradictory, and sort of say, well, this interpretation just isn't well defined, we don't know what it means, so let me just dismiss it. This last strategy here isn't actually from Nawson. Nawson kind of admits in his book that there are modern variants, but he's not going to talk about them. But I recently was at a talk by David Wallace where he did exactly this. What you do is you take one of the modern authors, maybe Chris. In David Wallace's case, he took a paper by Richard Healy, right? Quoted a paragraph from that paper, and then proceeded to completely demolish it, right, and show that it was saying something completely crazy. But the point is that if you're fixating on some aspect that is not really key to the basic Copenhagenish program, it's something that different Copenhagenish people disagree on, then arguing against that doesn't really do much against the basic program, right? So the idea here is that if we can define the common core precisely, then we will steel man this kind of interpretation and make it much clearer what assumptions you really have to challenge if you're going to try and argue against this view. So that's why I think it's important to do that. I know that everybody has their disagreements and those are important, but let's try and see how much we can agree. All right. All right. So Okay, so I've kind of classified some Copenhagenish interpretations here. There's an important distinction, which is the key distinction when it comes to these Bell-Wigner's friend mashups, and this is similar to what Czeslaw is arguing, between objective Copenhagen interpretations and perspectival Copenhagen interpretations. And I think quantum Bayesianism, when in the transition to cubism, basically what happened was it moved over to this side. So what is this distinction? So in the objective version, there's an objective fact of the matter about what an observer observes, right? So when some observer goes into the laboratory, sees a detector click, that's a fact about the universe now, what that detector click is. And perspectival, the word perspectival means that basically different people have different truths, right? So I think perspectival is the right word. I mean, this is a matter of terminology, but I think perspectival is definitely the right word here. Some people, Ravelli, for example, likes to use the word relational. He means the same thing, but it's actually very different what's going on. So a theory like relativity is relational in the sense that Alice and Bob, in different frames of reference, may disagree on the amount of time that has elapsed between two events. But nonetheless, there is a one-to-one translation between their 2 points of view. There's a symmetry group that connects them. And there is still a global truth from which both of those might be derived. So the picture in terms of trajectories on a manifold in space-time coordinate-free is a global truth from which you can derive all of those pictures. In Wigner's friend type of experiment, there's just no question of being able to translate between Wigner's point of view and Alice's point of view in the box one-to-one, right? You cannot, from Wigner's state, determine what Alice's measurement outcome is. There's no one-to-one translation. So it's really what's true. The notion of truth depends on observer. It's much stronger than relationalism. That's why.
Subjective.
Sorry?
What's wrong with subjective?
Because, I mean, you can say something like, so I'm trying to distinguish here. I mean, in cubism, for instance, in Bayesianism, in subjective Bayesianism, you say that the quantum state is subjective, for instance. But that doesn't really mean much for reality. Right? It doesn't mean much for truth, right? You can still have subjective states, but the core truth of reality is one thing. You just have different information about it.
Maybe it has to do with how you divide up the word perceive, because perception has a component which is kind of more about your own predisposition and another part which is more about the world's disposition.
Right. I mean, it's a matter of terminology at the end of the day. I like this terminology because it's really about truth, right? So perspectival means truth.
When you say perspectival is about truth, do you mean that one agent can know the truth P, let's say, and another agent not P? When you say they have different truths,
in principle,
you actually mean there can be contradictory truths.
In principle, yeah.
Okay.
So that. So I'm not interested. So I've put original Copenhagen here. I'm not really interested in analyzing history. I think there's a good argument to be made that you could put Niels Bohr in this category, but I'm not actually going to make that argument because I'm not a historian. I'm more interested in analyzing the sort of modern Copenhagenish type of interpretations. Okay, so here's what I think the common ground is, and maybe this will be controversial amongst some of you. But first of all, the intuition. Why do people come to Copenhagenish interpretations in the first place? I think basically it's for these three reasons. So the first thing is you're deeply skeptical that the quantum formalism is a direct representation of reality. Well, both Chris and Rob Spekens and plenty of people have given us plenty of evidence for thinking that the quantum state, for example, is not a direct representation of reality. We have good reasons for believing that, so there's good reasons to be skeptical. Nonetheless, you want the ordinary classical reality we see around us to be straightforwardly true, unlike in, say, Everett, where there's a long derivation between the ontology and what we actually see. The idea here is, look, there's the empirical evidence on which we based our view that quantum mechanics is true, the clicks in the detectors and things like that, right? If those things aren't true, then you've got a sort of job to do to explain, why quantum theory doesn't undermine its own evidence, the evidence for its truth. So you want things like detector clicks to like just straightforwardly happen. They really happen in the world. But nonetheless, you still want to view quantum theory as the complete fundamental theory of physics. As far as we know, there is no system. Every time we try to test quantum mechanics in the lab, it passes with flying colors. So as far as we're concerned today, at least as a hypothesis for now, it seems to be a good one to say that quantum theory is just really a fundamental theory of physics. Okay, so what I want to do is make this more concrete. So there are 4 precise assumptions which sort of precisify this intuition, which I think at least the vast majority of Copenhagenish people would agree with. So these are the 4 assumptions which I'll go into in more details. Note that the first one is really a version of no solipsism, which I hope will make Chris happy, since given how many times he's accused of being a solipsist. Okay, so let me run through these 4 assumptions. And this is a good time, by the way, to object. If you're a Copenhagenist in the audience, it's a good time to raise objections as I'm going through this. So observers observe.
Objection then. Again, this comes down to terminology, but this is a point of terminology on which I've seen multiple people get hung up over the years. Bullet point 1B, you want the ordinary classical reality that we see around us to be straightforwardly true. Now, what you said verbally was great, I think, but the text on your slide, ordinary classical reality, the word classical has a lot of baggage. For example, is Aristotelian physics classical?
So I...
What did you say in verbally? I was reading it and missed what you actually said.
This is, I shouldn't have written this on the slide, because I, like, the word classical is something I do think should be banned from the lexicon, ideally. What I meant was what I said. What I said is, we want it to be that the things that we take as evidence for quantum theory, like the clicks in detectors, to be straightforwardly true. They happen, right? They really happen. There really is a fact of the matter about whether my Geiger counter clicked or not, right? Those are the things. That's the empirical evidence for quantum mechanics. So it would be strange if we lived in a world in which those weren't straightforwardly true facts in some sense.
Would you call that a broadly empiricist stance?
Broadly, it's an aspect of empiricism, right? I wouldn't say the interpretation as a whole is empiricist, but it's clear that, at the founding of quantum mechanics, there was a certain degree of empiricist leanings, right? Heisenberg made the jump from trying to get a picture of reality to trying to connect observables to one another. So that's a somewhat empiricist stance, and that aspect of empiricism, I would say, lives on in these kind of interpretations to some degree. Does that make sense? Okay. All right, so let me go in a bit. When I go in a bit more depth, these things will become more precise, what I mean. Okay, so observers observe. Okay, so I know from my own experience that I am the type of entity that experience definite outcomes when I make a quantum measurement. Right, I'm a theorist, so I don't do this often, but when I was an undergraduate, I did do the single photon double slit experiment, and I saw definite outcomes, right? I saw really the photon landing at a particular place on the screen, at least in my readout. Okay, so I know that for a fact. I just inspect my own experience. Now, because I'm not a solipsist, I assume that other entities that are similarly constituted, for instance, graduate students who I might send into the lab, also have the same experience. Right? This is the no solipsism. I'm not special I'm not some kind of special observer. Everybody else who is similarly constituted to me also has that same experience. So by this I don't mean that you need consciousness, human observers, or any of that to be necessary in order for some definite outcome to occur in a measurement. You could accept whatever account you want. You might accept a decoherence account, depends on which interpretation you subscribe to. The only thing that matters is that I know that a human observation is sufficient for a definite outcome to occur. And that's just by inspecting my own experience and assuming no solipsism. Okay, so we can divide this, and this is where the two types of interpretations differ, into an objective version and a perspectival version. In the objective version, it says that if I send you into the lab to make a measurement and you observe the result, then that measurement outcome is an objective fact about the universe. I may not know it, I may not have access to it, but nonetheless it's a fact. And then there's the perspectival version, which says when you make a measurement and observe the result, then that is a fact for you. There's no fact of the matter for me unless I go in and repeat the measurement myself, or unless I talk to you and ask you what the measurement outcome was. It just isn't a fact for me. Okay, so that's the perspectival version. Any queries about that? Everybody happy? More or less? Okay. Universality. So this is the...
Actually, sorry.
Yeah, okay.
So
I want people to object because I'm trying to find common ground.
Well, I'm trying not to complain about your... Well, you misspelled perspectival.
Okay.
But but maybe this is... I'm trying not to complain about the terms since you set the ground rules.
I'm trying to find common ground, but if I fail to find common ground, then I want to know that.
Perspectival, to me, implies that one is seeing a perspective. Or for instance, there's a three-dimensional object, and I'm looking at this projection, I'm looking at that projection, I'm seeing this perspective of it, that perspective of it.
Yeah, well, that's not...
Whereas that is distinct from the idea that you say here. When you make a measurement and observe the result, then these are facts for you. You're not contemplating that there's some common way to put them all together.
It's not the way perspectival is used in philosophy. In philosophy, perspectival really means that truth is relative, and that there is no global perspective from which each of those can be derived.
Perspectival means there is no global perspective.
It means that. So what you...
Why don't they call it non-perspectival? Anti-perspectival.
I mean, terminology is terminology, right? So,
okay. So perspectival means there is no global.
I'm distinguishing that from relational, in which there would be a global, in which people would differ in what they say is true, but nonetheless, all those things are derived from a global picture. Okay. I would call that relational rather than perspectival. That's just So it's just
it rules out the possibility of having a global perspective, or is agnostic to?
I would say it rules it out, because we're just denying that there are objective facts, basically. If you say that somebody can say that a measurement result has occurred and somebody else says it hasn't, then there's no way of putting those together into a single picture.
Maybe this is diving in too deep too soon, but your very last statement there is no fact of the matter for me unless I repeat the measurement myself or interact with you. So I would think that a strong perspectivalism would say that, well, you make a measurement and observe the result, there's a fact of the matter for you. My making a measurement, the same measurement, we'd say we both measure the energy of the same coffee cup, well then my result is a result for me, and perspectively your result is a result for you. Our sample spaces still don't overlap. And if I ask you what your result was, I'm in fact performing a different measurement than just measuring the energy of the coffee cup. So it's not a fact of the same.
Here I'm just appealing to quantum mechanics in the sense that, we know in quantum mechanics that those things happen to agree. So although we can have a perspectival view of quantum mechanics, we don't have to be so wholesale in our perspectival views to deny things like that. You can be, of course, you can go that far, but I don't think it's necessary to go that far, right? So I can take somebody else's report of a measurement outcome as a reason for believing in the measurement outcome. Mathematics of quantum mechanics says that I will come into agreement with you if I do that, and there's I don't see a real reason for being more perspectival than that, but obviously you could be. You don't seem convinced.
I thought that's what this whole meeting was about.
Okay, let me move on. I was only 1 out of 4 principles, so we're going to be here a long time. Universality.
Which you misspelled.
Obviously, my spell check is not working either. So this is the idea that I was alluding to before, which is that you want me to go in and correct it now while I'm talking. That's what I do in class if I make a mistake. I would correct the slides as you go along, otherwise you'll never correct it. So quantum theory is a fundamental physical theory. Now, this means that anything in the universe, and there's this qualification here, perhaps not everything at once, but anything in the universe can in principle be described by quantum theory. So there is no fundamentally classical non-quantum, okay, now I'm using the air quotes to, because this is as we've heard, this is an imprecise word, but there's no fundamentally non-quantum systems in the universe. Okay, so in principle, I can describe anything, including another observer, by quantum mechanics. So that as a result of that, I could arrange a situation in which I would describe the state of a student doing an experiment as being a superposition of macroscopically distinct states. There's no sort of fundamental cut at which quantum mechanics ceases to hold. And this is what makes sort of the Copenhagenism not operationalism, right? So if you're an operationalist, you say, okay, there's some concept called a quantum measurement. I'm putting that in by hand, and everything is relative to what that quantum measurement is. I'm describing probabilities for that quantum measurement. And you don't say anything about what constitutes a measurement in operationalism, at least not in pure operationalism. But here we're not saying that. We're saying there's no fundamental distinction. In this regard, it's quite similar to Everett. In fact, as I'll show in a minute, fully 50% of the assumptions here are in common with Everett. So Copenhagenishism is a bit closer to Everett than you might first imagine.
Right. Maybe just one comment that anything in the universe except the entire universe, perhaps.
Perhaps, but I'm being deliberately cagey about that. I think there are versions of Copenhagenish interpretations in which you can make sense of the quantum state of the universe, particularly if your description is sort of coarse-grained enough that it doesn't really contain information that identifies you. Which, when I write down the state of the early universe, it's really like that, right? So I don't personally think that there's any big problem with that, but I know that if you are Asher Perez, for instance, you would definitely say there's no wave function of the universe. So that's allowed in this view, but I'm trying to be as inclusive as I possibly can, so I'm not going to say that for sure. All right. So now you might immediately think that the two assumptions we have already are already in contradiction, because universality implies that I can describe a measurement interaction coherently like this. However, if you're the observer, observers observe implies that there's a collapse. And so, a lot of people say, well, Copenhagenish interpretations have a measurement problem, but it's not true, because this assumes, I'll use, I think it's Jeff Boob's terminology, which is that it assumes that these are truth makers of propositions, or something like that. Or was that Butowski who said that? I can't remember. One of you said that. One of you said that. So it assumes that we believe that quantum states are objective ontic states somehow, or is assuming something like the eigenvalue-eigenstate link. If you have the eigenvalue-eigenstate link, it means that the properties of systems are the observables of which you're an eigenstate, and those are just different here. So that would be a contradiction. But I haven't said anything that we believe anything like this. And in fact, the next assumption is anti-Psi-ontology, which says that quantum states are not ontic. They're not intrinsic properties of an individual quantum system. So quantum systems don't go around with like labels on their head saying what their quantum state is. Now, what do we say they are instead? What we say they are instead depends on the Copenhagenish interpretation, and this is the source of a lot of the conflict between different Copenhagenish interpretations. But people will say things like they represent our knowledge, our information, our beliefs, what we can say, advice. These are all phrases found in the literature in specific interpretations.
This is what we can say.
Bohr. Niels Bohr. There's a famous quote, but it's a kind of a second-hand quote. It's somebody quoting what somebody else said about Bohr. So exactly. Yeah, I think it's something like that. But yeah, there is a quote of Niels Bohr where he says, "It's what we can say," and I believe that the language aspect was somehow important for Bohr, but I don't want to get into the historical weeds. So the point is that now if we have two different descriptions of a measurement, they don't need to be contradictory because these don't represent states of reality. They can just represent the descriptions of two different observers. They have different beliefs, different information, or something like that. No problem. By the way, personally and previously, I've called this the psi-epistemic view. I'm happy to call this psi-epistemic because I have sort of a very broad interpretation of what that means. But I know that some people are upset by it because obviously this has the connotation of knowledge specifically. So I'm not saying that. Okay? I'm just saying anti-scientology. That's all we need. Okay, and lastly, completeness, which is just the idea that despite all this, despite the fact that we don't have a description of reality here, nonetheless, there is no deeper description. So this is, again, part of the idea that quantum theory is supposed to be fundamental. So if I describe a system quantum mechanically, all I have is the quantum description of it. And that quantum description is not a description of reality. So if there is no deeper description of a quantum system, this could be for a couple of reasons. So we have to talk about, when I'm describing a system quantum mechanically, does it have properties or not? But can I say that it has properties? I could say that quantum systems do indeed have properties, but they're ineffable. Here's another word that I like. Is everybody familiar with that word, ineffable? Okay, there's some. It actually historically comes from theology, because the properties of God were supposed to be ineffable. Somehow it's supposed to be impossible for human beings to comprehend the nature of God. But these days it sort of means it's literally impossible to describe it in any way.
I thought it came from Harvey Brown.
Yeah.
Because he says that cubism takes the world to be ineffable.
Right.
Chris, why do you think the world is ineffable?
So I don't think that is the view of cubism, but I think it possibly is Niels Bohr's view. So somehow there are properties, but it's literally impossible to talk about them. So you would say that the moon actually is there when nobody's looking, but if I'm describing the moon quantum mechanically, then somehow it's fundamentally impossible to describe those properties in language, pictures, mathematics, computer code, anything else that you could possibly imagine, any way of communicating it. So I think this would be actually Niels Bohr's response to Einstein saying, "Is the moon there when when nobody's looking?" But again, I'm not trying to do a historical analysis.
Just a question for clarification.
Yeah.
How do you measure outcomes in this picture?
If I'm so I have a choice to make, right? I can choose to describe something quantum mechanically. If I choose to describe something quantum mechanically, then it has no properties. So we'll be talking about the Heisenberg cut in a minute. And of course, if I need to describe properties of something, then I need to not describe it quantum mechanically, is the point.
So that's why you have two systems we are describing. So this is really the condition, this choice in this first sentence, that is important. I mean, if I read this, you said no ontic states assigned to systems we are describing quantum mechanically.
Yeah,
so you're really saying there are other
systems
we are not describing quantum mechanically.
So remember, universality says I can in principle describe anything quantum mechanically. Once I've made a decision to describe something quantum mechanically, then this is going to apply. You don't have to describe. everything quantum mechanically. The other option is, of course, that quantum systems literally have no properties. So the moon is not there when nobody is looking. So if you want to be an objective Copenhagen, then of course you need option 1, because if you're an objective Copenhagen person, then you believe that there are facts about measurement outcomes. So if I put Wigner's friend in a box and he observes a measurement outcome, I'm describing that quantum mechanically. I must believe that there are properties, just I somehow can't describe them in any way. Option 2 can be made perspectival, because I can talk about whether something has properties for me or for you, right? So I can say that for me, the moon has no properties when I'm not looking at it, but for somebody else, maybe it does, because they are looking at it. Or for Wigner, the friend has no properties, but for the friend, there's a definite measurement outcome, right? So in either case, because we're not having a deeper reality behind our quantum mechanical descriptions, in either case, quantum states are going to represent knowledge, information, beliefs, all that kind of stuff about our future interactions with the quantum systems, about measurements, not about some underlying reality. Okay, so those 4 points are what I take to be the core of the Copenhagenish position. Do any Copenhagenists in the audience strongly disagree with any of those, or did I do a relatively good job of characterizing it? Chris is nodding. Oh, wow. Never thought I'd get Chris to agree to anything. All right. I just want to make a quick comparison with Everett, right? Because Copenhagenish interpretations fully share half of their assumptions with Everett. You get Everett by just changing assumptions 1 and 3. Right, so this is the easy one to describe. Instead of anti-Scientology, we literally believe that the quantum state is the description of reality. And then instead of observers observe, you have this kind of structural realism type of point of view, which says that you can, so what we observe isn't fundamental in any way, but you can kind of reconstruct what's supposed to be the classical world by looking for persistent structures in the wave function kind of thing in a sort of emergence account. Right, so if you change those two things, but on universality and completeness, they're in complete agreement. So let's look at some of the arguments we were talking about earlier. So an Everettian, a naive argument against many worlds is to say, well, I just don't like many worlds, it's implausible. An Everettian will turn around and say, well, no, in Everett we don't posit many worlds. If you talk to somebody like Simon Saunders, he often uses this strategy. He says, do you believe in unitary quantum mechanics? And then you say, yes. And then he says, well, then you believe in many worlds. I don't think it's quite as straightforward as that, because I think you really need all of this background to get there. But the point is that in Everett, the many worlds are derived from the 4 basic assumptions, and each of these 4 assumptions is more plausible than just positing many worlds. So you can't refute the interpretation just by saying that you don't like many worlds. You have to say what's wrong with these assumptions. So similarly, now I know that Chris doesn't like the term anti-realism, but there's a certain degree of anti-realism, because there are cases in which we're not ascribing systems properties. That's what I mean by the anti-realism. In Copenhagenish views, you don't posit anti-realism, right? This is not often appreciated. It's not that we start off being hardcore anti-realists and so are happy with that. It's that we have these assumptions which we think are plausible, and the degree of anti-realism that we have is derived from those 4 assumptions, each of which is more plausible. Like all the 4 assumptions that we had were more plausible than just asserting anti-realism. Therefore, you can't refute these Copenhagenish views just by saying that you don't like anti-realism. You have to point to the 4 assumptions and say, that's the one that I think is wrong. So just saying you don't like anti-realism is a bad argumentative strategy. By the way, how much time do I have? I know I'm probably going over time.
Oh, I thought you were the chair.
How can I chair myself?
Well, I went over.
Okay.
By 15 minutes.
All right.
And you have been speaking for 37 minutes.
Okay.
15. But you're also an organizer, so you might.
Yeah, but if we speak for too long, then we're setting a very bad precedent for the entire rest of the meeting. Okay. So
you're at the 37 mark.
All right. I'll try and speed up. So, I mean, a lot of this stuff is familiar, but I think it is important to precisify it. So these four principles that we have are in a certain amount of tension, of course. If universality is true, then I can describe another observer making a measurement as being in a coherent superposition like this. But if completeness is true, then necessarily, when I'm describing you that way, I can't ascribe you any properties. Okay, so in particular, if I want to account for my own observations, so I have definite experiences, I know that I have definite experiences, then saying that I have those experiences is ascribing a property to me, so that I can necessarily cannot include myself in my own quantum descriptions. Okay, so it's necessary, anybody using quantum theory necessarily has to split the world into two parts. The part that's going to be described quantum mechanically, and the part that's going to be excluded from that description so that properties can be ascribed to it, which you might call the classical part. But, you know, as Blake's question was alluding to earlier, what's important is the ability to ascribe properties, not anything else about classical physics. And so that's called the Heisenberg cut between those two parts. And then we have the shifty split. By the way, the earliest mention of the word shifty split I can find is in a paper by John Bell. It's sometimes attributed to different other people in that, but that's, if anybody knows the earliest occurrence, let me know. So, however, if universality is true, there can't be a fundamental place where I have to put the Heisenberg cut. It must be movable. I must be able to describe anything in principle quantum mechanically. So the way that you do this is you is you set it pragmatically. So there will be some lowest level at which you can place the split, because if you place it any lower, you'll get the predictions wrong. So if you're going to coherently interfere certain degrees of freedom, you can't put that in the classical part. It has to be in the quantum part. There's also a highest level, which is that you have to put the split in front of yourself if you want to account for your own experiences. So there's going to be a range of levels. You might use decoherence theory or whatever account you prefer to decide where this lowest level is. But in any case, there's a range of possible levels. Okay, so at these different levels, the quantum states that you assign are going to be different. But that doesn't matter because we're anti-Scientologists. All that matters is that the different levels should agree on the predictions for experiments actually performed. If they agree on that, then they are equally good descriptions. Okay, so now we're going to start to come to Wigner's friend. So each observer has, in principle, a different range of levels between their highest and lowest. The highest is always different because my highest is in front of me and your highest is in front of you. But you might have thought that it would be nice if it were the case that for any two observers, it's always possible to find a range of levels they can agree on, like this. Right, so if that were the case, we can just say, okay, well, as long as Alice and Bob use a description at that level, within those range of levels, then they'll just agree with each other and everything's fine. So that's a case of level agreement, whereas this is a case of level conflict where Alice's lowest level is higher than Bob's highest level. Right? So they won't be able to reach a common description if that's the case. And the point of the Wigner's friend experiment, what makes it different from Schrodinger's cat and the measurement problem, is that it's a demonstration that level conflicts can happen. Right? So in the Wigner's friend experiment, the difference is that the friend is unambiguously something that we're willing to call an observer. You can put whatever you need, whatever you think you need in your interpretation in the box to make sure that an observation happens inside the box, right? So if you believe in decoherence theory, you put the entire environment in there, whatever you think is needed. Wigner can, before he opens the box, put the cut above his friend and describe him as being in a coherent superposition, but the friend's highest level is necessarily below herself, so she has to collapse the state. So this is a case of level conflict. So the friend might say, well, come on, Wigner, just put your cut lower so that we can get into level agreement with each other. And Wigner will say, no, sorry, I'm contemplating doing an interference experiment on you, so this is actually my lowest possible level, and now we necessarily have a level conflict, right? There's no way of always reaching level agreement. So nonetheless, you might say, well, okay, level conflicts happen in rather crazy experiments. However, you might have also thought that it's possible that in the long run, after everything's shaken out, at the end of the experiment, level agreement will be possible. And the reason why you might think that is because as soon as the friend tells Vigna her measurement outcome, or Vigna opens the box and looks himself, then they'll both be able to agree on the collapse state and they'll be in level agreement again. But this doesn't always happen because Vigna can actually do the coherent experiment on his friend and then the disagreement persists. This I call the Vigna's enemy experiment. We should all adopt this terminology because erasing your friend's memory is a pretty nasty thing to do. So it's no longer Vigna's friend. Friends don't recohere friends. It's a bad thing to do.
Yeah. And this is usually it said it erase Vigna's friend memory. But imagine that the state from the very beginning is the state in which you want just to confirm this state. So from the point of view of Vigna, is not disturbing measurement. Maybe there is still erasing, but it's not obvious that there is anything like that.
By the way, I have a name for that experiment too, but I really, from the point of view of that experiment, it would be really great if Vigna was the one in the box, because then I could call it Vigna's stalker. It's like somebody who's, so it's really Vigna's stalkee, right? So Vigna is really, really interested in the state of the friend, but doesn't want the friend to know that they've been touched or anything like that. So it's like, it's Vigna's stalkee, that experiment. Yeah, I mean, basically they're effectively equivalent in some sense because the two experiments are the measurement that you have to do is related by some unitary transformation, which in one case you actually do the unitary transformation, and in the other case you don't. You do the more complicated measurement. So I don't think personally that there's any special difference between those two experiments. They have the same kind of implications, I think, but we can discuss that later.
Is there anything retrocausal about this?
Not so far.
No, I mean, if you're going to go back and erase, could you do something a retrocausal kind of way where you're going to go back and erase, I guess the friend's memory gets erased to establish the cut? Could that have an effect on what happened at the cut?
So let's table that for a discussion later, I think. This is good. Yeah.
So it's a question about the highest level of the cut. So you said that I cannot put it above I need to put it in front of me if I want to account for my experience. But if I'm the friend and I want to account for, say, Vigner's enemy experiment, then I would put the cut above me for this purpose.
It's going to cause a problem, and I'm going to get to that in a minute, right? So I think sort of what the friend certainly can do is the following. Before the experiment, Vigna and the friend could get together and have a discussion and say, well, this is the way the experiment's going to go, what will happen in the experiment. And then because they're not considering their actual state, but the hypothetical state that they will be in, it's perfectly possible for the friend to describe themselves quantum mechanically in that situation, I think. But once the friend's actually in the box and actually has the observation, they can't unsee they can't make themselves not see the observation. So in that situation, when they're actually in the experiment, I would say he necessarily at that point has to put the cut in front of themselves. But the friend can definitely contemplate what happens in the experiment sort of abstractly, and that I'm going to do just now. Okay, so Vigner's enemy experiment. So I want to treat the friend as a qubit. So I know it's like a rough model. So I'm going to say the friend viewing up state is the same as her ready state before the measurement. Then we can give a unitary interaction that actually does the measurement. It's just basically a C0 gate. This unitary is its own inverse, so Vigner can undo it and recohere his friend by just applying it a second time. So if we start off in this state, Vigner starts with this state, applies the recohering operation, gets back to the initial state. But if the friend thinks they've seen since they're going to see a definite measurement outcome, and then we apply this recohering interaction to that, then, for instance, if we consider this case, the undoing leaves the state unchanged. So now at the end of the experiment, Vigner and the friend agree.
But whose description is the second one?
Well, this is the problem.
So, because she's ascribing a quantum state to herself.
So what I'm imagining here
you said we're not going to do that.
What I'm imagining here is the friend contemplating what might happen to her in the experiment before it's actually happening or something like that. So when she's actually in the experiment, her memory gets erased and she certainly can't perform this kind of analysis. Anyway, I'm going to get to that on the next slide. Okay. The point is that there's no level conflict here at this point, but they still disagree on the state of the spin. Maybe that doesn't really matter because we're anti-Scientologists. But anyway, so this is what Chris is saying. So in order for the friend to compute what happens in the undoing, she needed to apply quantum mechanics to herself. That conflicts with the idea that her highest level is before herself. So the easiest thing to say is just that the friend's application of quantum theory here is illegitimate, and somehow only Wigner's description is reliable. And I think, Chris, you have a description of what's going on in this experiment in one of your papers where you talk about it's as if somebody bashed the friend on the head with a hammer and they had amnesia, and you certainly wouldn't expect somebody to have a coherent physical account of what's going on in that sort of thing, right? So you could take that line, and that line's perfectly fine. It's a little bit problematic, I think, to have some possible experiments for which some observers necessarily have no physical description, but that's, I mean, it doesn't really matter for the present purposes. We could say that the application is okay and nonetheless not insist that different observers have to assign the same pure state even when they reach level agreement. And in cubism, for instance, different pure state assignments are perfectly fine. We are being anti-Scientologists after all. In any case, none of this proves anything, right? Because just saying that there's a different quantum state assignment doesn't mean anything for a Copenhagenist. If we want to actually rule something out, we need to go further. Wigner's friend and Wigner's enemy have failed to actually rule anything out. So we need the Bell-Wigner mashup.
What is a mashup?
What's a mashup? It's where you take two things and mash them together.
So we're putting them together, or they're conflicting?
No, we're mashing them together.
Mashing them.
It's the experiment you think. I have difficulty with the terminology for this experiment for the following reason, which is that there are too many origins. Just to give some appropriate credit where it's due. Obviously, Kozlov has a no-go theorem from, it comes from a talk in 2014. I don't know, probably thought of it before then, but you posted a paper in 2015 about this. An experiment, a no-go theorem for observer-independent facts using a mashup of the CHSH and Wigner's friend. Then in 2016 came the Frauscheiger-Renner paper, which was initially said to be a no-go theorem for self-consistency of single-world interpretations, and later, after much discussion, was changed to quantum theory cannot consistently describe the use of itself. And that's a similar kind of experiment, only based on Hardy's paradox rather than CHSH, and the analysis is obviously very different. The way I came into this was basically through Matt Pusey, because there's an online thread where it's mentioned that Luis Massanes is describing a CHSH Wigner version of Frauscheiger-Renner. Matt Pusey discussed that particular version in the context of a talk about cubism, which was at least very influential on me. I don't know about anybody else. The analysis I'm giving here is something of a little bit of a refinement of Matt Pusey's analysis. I'll give him a lot of credit for thinking this way. So I don't know what to call this experiment. Should we call it the Bruckner-Frauscheiger-Renner-Massanes-Pusey theorem? But that's quite a mouthful. That's why I'm just sticking with calling it a Bell-Wigner mashup, because that's what it is. But that's where the credit is due. I think Kozlov was definitely the first person to think about this kind of thing. Okay, so here's the way it works. So I'm going to give a version that's a bit like Kozlov's version, but not exactly the same. Slightly different assumptions. So we consider two systems prepared in the maximally entangled state. Alice has two observables, A0 and A1, she can measure on system A. Bob has two observables, B0 and B1. These are all going to be two outcome observables, so the setup is just like in the CHSH inequality. Now we're going to consider looking at this experiment from the point of view of a third observer, Wigner, and Wigner describes the whole thing in terms of coherent unitary interactions. So for Wigner, Alice and Bob and these systems are all in a box, and he's describing the whole thing according to unitary quantum mechanics. Okay, so since Wigner's description is unitary, it means that for any observable Alice and Bob measures, Wigner can in principle undo that measurement by reversing the coherent unitary interaction. Okay, so instead of the usual Bell setup, what we're going to do here is have Alice and Bob measure both of their observables in each run of the experiment. Okay, so Alice measures A0, then Wigner comes in and recoheres her, erases her memory, undoes the experiment, and then she does A1. And similarly for Bob and B0 and B1. So this is what the experimental implementation looks like from Wigner's point of view. Right? So this is the unitary that implements A0, it gets undone, A1 happens, and similarly for Bob. Okay, so now we're going to assume the objective version of observers observe. If we assume the objective version of observers observe, then it means that because Alice and Bob are observers, they see definite clicks, and those are facts about the universe. So on every run of the experiment, there is some set of outcomes, and we'll call those by little a, little a0, little a1, etc. Okay? So we can repeat this experiment multiple times, perhaps in parallel. They do them all at the same time. And then there's just a fact of the matter about what is the relative frequency of outcomes in those experiments. There is a relative frequency according to the objective version of observers observe, so there is a mathematical object that has the form of a joint probability distribution. And that's just from the fact that there are definite outcomes. So this thing exists, right? Okay, then we invoke Fine's theorem, which tells us that if you have a joint probability distribution, then you have a locally causal model. Okay, I'm not going to go through the details of that, it's pretty straightforward. Okay, so the existence of a joint probability distribution tells us, therefore, that there's a local model. Therefore, the outcomes in this experiment have to satisfy the CHSH inequality, but we know that the quantum predictions do not. So the conclusion from that is that at least one of the marginal distributions that appears in the CHSH inequality, at least one of them must fail to agree with the quantum predictions. And now comes the question, which ones absolutely have to obey the quantum predictions on pain of falsifying quantum theory, right? So this depends on how Wigner performs the experiment. So if a pair of outcomes persists for a very long time, such that Alice and Bob can get together, discuss their outcomes, write a Nature paper about it. Remember, they might have performed this many times in parallel, so they've got the full probability distribution for that marginal. Then if they find that it disagrees with quantum mechanics, then that would falsify quantum mechanics, right? So we must have those things agree with quantum mechanics. On the other hand, if they're unable to do this, then in principle, you don't falsify quantum theory if you fail to agree with the quantum predictions. So here's like one way of implementing the experiment. We choose two time periods, big T and little t. We make big T be very long and little t be very short, right? And we imagine that these two experiments are close enough that within the time period t, Alice and Bob here could get together and publish a Nature paper. And remember, we're imagining that Wigner is all-powerful here. So if Alice and Bob get together and they have correlations with each other and there's correlations with Nature magazine, then Wigner can still coherently undo all that. He can put the entire Earth inside the box if he has to, right? So in this case, three marginals have, these are the ones that persist for a arbitrarily long period of time. So Alice and Bob could publish Nature articles about these three marginals. So they have to be quantum on pain of falsifying quantum theory, but this one doesn't, because there's never a time in which A0 and B1 exist at the same time. On the other hand, if the experiment is implemented this way, swapping the roles of Alice and Bob, then it's a different marginal. It's A1, B0, which doesn't which you can't write a Nature article about. Okay, so that's a loophole, right? It says you can't get a contradiction because there's at least one marginal that doesn't have to be quantum, on pain of falsifying quantum theory. However, it's still a bit bizarre because there's nothing in the formalization of quantum theory that would explain why you get different non-quantum marginals in the two experiments. You'd have to imagine that there's some sort of mechanism that communicates to Alice's system whether or not Bob's second measurement has happened yet, and vice versa. And that's the kind of thing that you may be prepared to posit in, say, a hidden variable theory. But Copenhagenish quantum theory is supposed to be sort of just the raw quantum mechanics in some sense. Copenhagenists only have the quantum formalism to rely on, and the two experiments are described the same way in the formalism. So oughtn't they to make the same predictions? If you believe that, then you would say, well, the same marginals have to be quantum in both experiments, and that would imply all of them do, and then you get a contradiction. So another way of pumping the intuition here is to say, well, you can do this whole experiment at space-like separation, everything happening at space-like separation now. And then, in this case, which marginals have to be quantum? Well, really only A1, B1 has to be on pain of falsifying quantum mechanics. But here there seems to be no good reason for arbitrarily choosing one of the marginals to be non-quantum. And we also note that you can get to that experiment from either this one or that one just by reducing t, big T. If you reduce t, if you sort of slowly reduce the value of big T, then there has to be some point in which you transition from this marginal being non-quantum to something else, right? Because both of those, that experiment is a shortening of the time of both of these two, right? So at what point does which marginals are quantum change? So it seems rather implausible. Of course, if you're a pure operationalist, you'd just say, I only care about the possibility of falsifying quantum mechanics. But as I've emphasized, Copenhagenism is not pure operationalism because of this universality idea. So there doesn't seem to be a good reason for arbitrarily choosing certain marginal to be non-quantum in this case. All right, so I want to make a quick comparison to the other things in the literature. So Bruckner's assumptions are slightly different. One of the things he assumes is locality. As a result, he doesn't have a loophole because he can assume, like in Bell's theorem, that there are counterfactually alternative things that you can do, and you have locality, which enables you to put all those things together, basically. I haven't assumed locality here, and that's why I have a loophole. I'm not a big fan of assuming locality here because it makes it sort of slightly unclear what you're getting that goes beyond Bell's theorem. I'm deriving the assumption of joint probability from the 4 Copenhagenish assumptions instead. So it's sort of clear that the main idea doesn't have much to do with locality. It just has to do with there existing these objective outcomes and universality and so forth. So I prefer that, but of course it's good not to have loopholes. So the Frauscheiker-Renner argument is actually quite different. They have 2 Wigners, one Wigner who acts on Alice and one who acts on Bob. And what they derive and analyze is things about what agents believe about what other agents believe, right? So providing you're willing to take another agent's belief as your own, if Wigner can derive that Alice believes such and such with certainty, then Wigner ought to believe such and such with certainty, then you get a contradiction. But this isn't a great kind of argument from the Copenhagenish point of view, because it's really easy to weasel out just by saying that agents should not adopt each other's beliefs. You don't need to say anything about agent-independent realities, just you shouldn't adopt, if somebody believes something with certainty, doesn't mean I should believe it with certainty. So I think the key difference in the way that I'm analyzing this argument is that I only ever made assumptions about the point of view of just one single agent, Wigner. Everything is analyzed from just one single Wigner's point of view. It's not about contradictions between different agents. It's about a contradiction in what one single agent believes. And so you can't get out of that just by saying...
Sorry, can I ask for clarification? You say, from the point of view of just one Wigner, I had an impression that this is the description from the Wigner point of view. By the end of the day, the people who make a measurement, communicate with each other, are actually friends, and from the Wigner point of view, there was no measurement at all. Actually.
So remember that what I'm ruling out is the objective version of observers observe. So it's about Wigner's beliefs. Wigner believes that there are ineffable facts of the matter about what the outcomes are. He has absolutely no access to them, but he just has a belief that the outcomes exist. Right? But I'm only taking his point of view. I'm not saying anything about what Alice and Bob's outcomes actually are or anything like that. There's also the difference that Frau Scheiker-Renner used the Hardy paradox. I don't think it's a big deal. We could do a Hardy version of this too. I'm personally not that interested in the difference between probabilistic and logical kinds of arguments, but maybe you are interested in that. But you could do all of these things with other proofs of non-locality instead. I know I must be really low on time.
You've gone 1 hour and 3 minutes.
Okay, then I need to stop. So I'm not going to.
But not before this.
Well, I'm not going to say anything. I'm not going to say anything about this. I was just going to briefly out. But Chris will do a better job he already has done a better job of this. Just there are two main perspectival interpretations in the literature: relational quantum mechanics, cubism. I was going to say something about this. But
no, go back over this. Come on, because you had 20 minutes of discussion, and we've used a lot of your discussion already.
So.
Because I'd like to know what's the difference between cubism and Carlos.
I'll tell you that. Okay, so the obvious thing to do here, I think, is to give up on the objective version of observers observe. We'll say that Alice's outcomes only exist for Alice, Bob's only exist for Bob, neither exist for Wigner. Then there's no global perspective on which all outcomes can be said to exist, and hence no joint probability distribution. That's by far the obvious things to do. So cubism is an interpretation of this type. I would say that cubism is simply what you get, sort of logically what you get, if you combine this perspectival point of view with the idea that all probabilities are subjective Bayesian probabilities. Right? It's really sort of the logical conjunction of those two things. But that's cubism. So in cubism, in principle, every agents is an undefined primitive because probability theory, subjective Bayesian probability theory, is a theory of how agents make decisions. Every agent in principle has their own perspectival reality and their own subjective quantum state. Ravella's relational quantum mechanics is different. I've made this comment before. I think it should be called perspectival quantum mechanics because relational seems to indicate that there is a global perspective from which the different points of view can be derived. So he says that physical systems only have properties from the perspective of other systems, but these perspectival properties are nonetheless objective. The measurement has an outcome from the perspective of the physical system called the friend, but not from the perspective of the physical system called Wigner. Ravelli determines these properties by the eigenvalue-eigenstate link. He thinks there is a correct quantum state for each system to assign to every other system, and the eigenvalue-eigenstate link determines the properties. There's no conflict with the measurement problem because the two descriptions are descriptions from the perspective of different physical systems. The other thing here is that Ravelli thinks there's nothing particularly special about measurements or agents, so he will equally well talk about the properties of a single electron from the perspective of another electron. I'm not sure that's a great idea because I think it's going to run into something like a basis problem with Everett. If you have two electrons that we would describe as being in an entangled state, then how do I talk about what basis the state of one electron relative to the other one is in?
Is that connected to what Simon Cauchy used to call witnessing?
I don't know what that is,
Okay,
but probably.
But
yeah, but I think that if he were to fall back to the position that we're going to only assign properties to systems from the perspective of other systems that are sufficiently decoherent, then he would be okay. He doesn't necessarily want to do that, but I think that's what he should do. So I think that's the difference. Like Ravelli is very objective about what the perspectival properties actually are, and doesn't care about the notion of an agent.
Yeah. But also crucial here is the eigenvalue eigenstate.
Yeah. That's what makes things objective here.
Can I just add one thing? I would probably argue that Rovelli, I don't speak for him, but he would probably assume that the definition of space-like that you made, for example, earlier, would not quite follow classical structure either. Because his quantum system includes space-time.
Sure.
And yeah, there are no non-localities in loop quantum gravity, for example.
Okay. So anyway, just to conclude, I've taken far too much time, but both cubism and relational quantum mechanics are much more perspectival than they need to be. In cubism, in principle, every agent has their own reality. Most of the time they agree. There's no real explanation for why they agree fundamentally in cubism, but most of the time they do agree. But in principle, there are all these different perspectival realities. In Rovelli, in some sense, things are even worse because every single system potentially has a different description of every other physical system, although these descriptions are all supposed to be objective. But it's radically perspectival in that sense. So I try to think about what's the minimal thing that we have to do, just as an exercise. So the first thing to note is that it's always possible, in principle, for an all-powerful super observer to come along and recohere every observation made in the entire history of the universe. It would require, in general, sort of Maxwell's demon-like proficiency, but in principle it could happen. In principle it could happen just by chance, right? So therefore there is never a time at which it's safe to say that an observation has objectively occurred for absolutely everybody. The only thing we can say is that most of the time it's technologically impractical to recohere an observation. Would require, for instance, collecting all of the photons that are scattered off an apparatus. We'd have to put the Earth in a giant Dyson sphere to collect all that stuff and have like Maxwell's demon-like powers. So for Alice, it's safe to say that an observation has occurred just in case Alice lacks the technological ability to recohere that observation. And we can say that for everyone. So what counts as an observation is relative to the technological ability of the observer. Okay, that's safe. And it's a bit bizarre to say that the ontology, that what exists depends on technological ability. But what it does give you is that it implies that we all agree on the same objective reality most of the time. Everybody on Earth, for all practical purposes, unless we start doing Wigner's friend experiments, we live in the same reality. We just do because we have the same technological ability. So this avoids us having different realities from the perspective of every electron in the universe, and is, I think, sort of minimally perspectival. You may not like putting technological ability into fundamental physics, but that's just what happens when you do that. Okay, so that's it. So here's the summary. So unless you're willing to permit contortions about which marginal is allowed to be quantum, Bell-Wigner mashup seems to rule out objective Copenhagenish interpretations, which is most of them except cubism and relational quantum mechanics. It's worth reflecting that it's remarkable that there's any no-go theorems for Copenhagenish interpretations at all. So when I first realized this, I was really kind of shocked, because whenever you're proving no-go theorems in quantum mechanics, you normally start out by saying, assume there exists an ontic state lambda, right, which is the very first thing that Copenhagenish people deny. So almost every no-go theorem known to man applies nothing to Copenhagenish interpretations. So it's really remarkable that you can do anything. Copenhagen. I think it's still the case that Copenhagen is subscribed to by the vast majority of physicists, not in a sophisticated way. If you walk into a random physics department that isn't full of cosmologists or whatever, but regular physicists, and say, which interpretation do you agree? Most people will still say Copenhagen. And the reason they say Copenhagen is because they think it's built on level-headed empiricism, just like facts like detector clicks are really facts, and they don't want to talk about anything else, right? Things they see and do in the lab straightforwardly happen, so they think it's a very hard-headed empiricist kind of move. The reason, this straightforward empirical attitude, I think, is the reason why most physicists are still saying Copenhagen rather than things like Everett. Okay, but Bell-Wigner tells you, in some way, these Copenhagen interpretations are are similar to Everett because there are all these different realities. They're not different objectively existing realities, but they're realities from the perspective of different observers, which is like kind of a crazy conclusion to get to. So I think that if physicists appreciated this more, then they may be less inclined towards Copenhagenism. So Bell-Wigner might tend to drive you towards realism, but of course we have plenty of results, e.g. Bell's theorem itself, that make realism also problematic. So what do you do? If you don't want to embrace any of these things, and I'm not really quite ready to embrace any of these things, then we have to investigate things that might possibly get around all of the no-go results, like much more exotic kinds of ontology than we've considered so far. And since I'm so far over time, I'm not going to say anything about what those might be. So thanks for your attention.
Yeah, so I want to make a comment, because so it seems to me that in all of these Wigner's kind of results, so when you assume the objective facts, okay, I think you're assuming something more. That, I mean, in my opinion, it seems to me something that we might discuss about, which is the fact that these are not just objective facts, observer independence, but they persist in their existence to the fact that you raise information about them. So for example, in your example, you undo the unitary, this means you raise information about them. And then why should you infer that you can still build a joint probability distribution of them? So, for example, in the world, there might exist things that we have no longer information about, and for us, those things don't exist. So why should we?
There's clearly nobody who can, there's clearly no agent who can actually build this probability distribution, because there's nobody who knows all those results. But all I'm asserting is that, okay, if something exists, then it's erased, and then erased, there's still a fact about what value it had. And that's all I'm really using here.
Yeah, but you can even take this Deutsch trick and say, there was an outcome. I won't know which one.
I don't buy the Deutsch. I mean, the Deutsch.
But this gives you just some confidence that there was something.
It doesn't give me any confidence, because you can equally well say that when the friend is in a superposition of two states, he should write on the paper, I did not see a definite outcome. So then you can choose a basis of two superposition states, right? And for each of those, he should say, I did not see a definite outcome. And from that, you infer that when he does see a definite outcome, he should write, I do not see a definite outcome. So I see that argument as like totally inconclusive, because it kind of, it's a bit circular. It assumes the thing that you're trying to derive, which is that, you know, the agent will at some point say they see a definite outcome, but why should they? You know, there's an equal.
This could be a machine that you program as a Wigner. You don't need to trust them.
Sure, but there's equal reason for saying that. What I'm asserting is that there's equal intuition for saying that the person inside the box should write down that they don't see a definite outcome than there is for saying that they do see a definite outcome. I don't see that argument as at all.
I mean, the kind of machine that when every person hears a click, writes down a right click. I'm not saying this is necessary.
But then you have to assume that they. So bear in mind that Deutsch is usually presenting this argument in the context of many worlds, right? So you're thinking of an ontology as the wave function, and we don't have the observer's observe assumption. And so in that situation, you just have to sort of make the bold assertion that if you know, the observer is initially in a product state with the system, and then they in the appropriate, and the system's in one of the eigenstates, then that's a situation in which they would write down, I do see an observation, and then you use linearity. But there's an equal intuition which says that if it's in a superposition state, the spin is in a superposition state, then the whole thing ends up in a superposition state. Then in that circumstance, they should write down, I did not see a definite.
It's exactly there, because you don't need to assume any counterformance. You just believe this observer, and if she or he says, I saw a definite outcome, I don't even write the linearity, I don't even care. There is this evidence.
So if we're being Copenhagenish and we believe in the observer's observe assumption, then there's no need for the argument at all, because it's an assumption that observers observe. And so I don't need a piece of paper to confirm it in that case.
That's fine, but this was a reference to like, should we at all then assume that these joint probabilities exist in between the ratio? I would say, well, you can have some
piece of evidence of that.
People don't rely on any theory.
To quote Lewis Carroll, how can you talk with a person if they always say the same thing? If the message that comes out of the Deutsch box always says, I saw a definite outcome, and it's exactly the message that I expected to come out, that conveys no information in the Shannon sense or in the everyday sense of the word.
It does in a temporal standpoint, though. It matters when it comes out.
Yes, as long as you don't have the records, you would assume measurement has been taken.
But then, yeah, if there's any variability, then Prussen's reflection principle will come into the story, and that's a whole different rant. But I think the point about erasure is a very good one, because you're building up a table of relative frequencies, and if that table can't be built up, then you don't even have grounds to go from frequencies to probabilities with...
There's no actual person who's building up that table. I'm just asserting its mathematical existence. I'm not asserting that there's any agent who could actually build that table of probabilities.
I'm just saying that the solution might be to say you cannot compare outcomes that exist with outcomes that existed. And I think that's in a sense related to when, saying that you cannot consider counterfactual arguments, even if in this case it's not really about counterfactuality, but I
think we should...
Now,